Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The bitter winds of January 1851 carried more than snow through the cobblestone streets of Portland, Maine. They carried whispers of something unspeakable, something that would challenge the very foundations of what the townspeople believed about life, death, and the sacred rituals that separated the two. Dr. Elias Whitmore had served as the town's physician for nearly 3 decades, his weathered hands having delivered countless souls into the world and guided just as many toward their final rest. Yet nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for the document that arrived at his modest practice on 4th Street that frigid morning. The letter bore the official seal of St. Luke's Episcopal Church, its wax impression cracked from the cold journey across town. The correspondence, penned in the careful script of Father Benedict Ashworth, contained a request so extraordinary that Whitmore read it thrice before its implications fully settled upon his consciousness. The parish records indicated that 1 month prior, on December 15th, 1850, an infant had been interred in the church cemetery following what appeared to be a stillbirth. The child, according to the burial registry, belonged to the Blackwood family, recent arrivals to Portland from the remote settlements of northern Vermont. What disturbed Father Ashworth, and subsequently Dr. Whitmore, was not the burial itself, but rather an entry discovered in a separate ledger. The baptismal records, maintained with meticulous care by the church deacon, showed that the very same infant, identified by name, parentage, and date of birth, had received the sacrament of baptism on January 14th, 1851. Exactly 1 month after burial, Dr. Whitmore set down the letter with trembling fingers, his medical mind struggling to reconcile the impossible chronology. He had not attended the birth himself, as the Blackwood family had reportedly employed a midwife from their former community. The death certificate, however, bore his signature, a detail that filled him with growing unease, for he possessed no memory of examining the deceased child. The physician's personal journal, recovered decades later from his estate, reveals the profound disturbance this discovery caused him. In his entry dated January 20th, 1851, Whitmore wrote, "The very fabric of natural law seems to have been rent asunder in our quiet community. I find myself questioning not only my professional competence, but the reliability of my own senses. How does one examine a corpse that apparently drew breath again?" The Blackwood family resided in a modest dwelling on the outskirts of town, where the forest pressed close against civilization's fragile boundaries. Jeremiah Blackwood worked as a lumber surveyor, his profession requiring extended absences in the wilderness. His wife, Constance, was described by neighbors as a woman of unusual pallor and disposition, rarely seen in daylight hours and speaking in hushed tones when circumstances demanded conversation. Their cottage stood isolated among towering pines, its windows perpetually shrouded by heavy curtains that permitted no glimpse of the interior. The structure itself seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight even during the brightest winter days. Local children, with their innate sensitivity to the unnatural, crossed themselves when passing the property and quickened their pace until the dwelling disappeared behind the trees. Dr. Whitmore's investigation began with a careful examination of his own records. The death certificate, written in his own hand, documented the demise of one Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood, aged 3 days, cause of death listed as respiratory failure. Yet the signature appeared somehow foreign to him, as though penned by another's hand, despite bearing all the characteristics of his own penmanship. The baptismal record proved equally perplexing. Father Ashworth's notation described a healthy infant, alert and responsive during the ceremony. The witnesses listed included several prominent members of the congregation, individuals whose integrity and mental faculties were beyond question. Yet, when approached discreetly by Dr. Whitmore, Each claimed no recollection of attending such a baptism. As January's bitter days progressed, additional inconsistencies emerged. The cemetery caretaker, a man of unimpeachable honesty, swore that the small grave remained undisturbed since the burial. The earth showed no signs of excavation, the modest headstone stood exactly as positioned, and the winter frost had sealed the ground with impenetrable hardness. Yet the baptismal font at St. Luke's bore traces of an unusual residue, a substance that Father Ashworth described as neither holy water nor entirely earth, but something that seemed to exist between the two states. The holy water itself had taken on a peculiar quality, remaining liquid despite temperatures that should have frozen it solid. Dr. Whitmore concluded his initial investigation with more questions than answers. The medical evidence suggested impossibility, yet the documentary proof demanded acceptance of the unacceptable. In his journal's final entry regarding the matter, he wrote, "I fear we have stumbled upon something that challenges the very nature of existence itself. The boundary between life and death, so clearly defined in medical texts, appears to have become permeable in our small corner of creation." The mystery of Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood had only begun to unfold. The investigation into the Blackwood infant's impossible chronology led Dr. Whitmore to seek out the midwife who had attended the birth. According to parish records and whispered conversations among the townspeople, a woman named Macabre Crane had traveled from the remote settlement of Peacham, Vermont, to assist with the delivery. Her reputation preceded her, a practitioner of the old ways, versed in herbal remedies and birthing techniques passed down through generations of mountain women. Locating Macabre Crane proved more challenging than anticipated. The address provided by the Blackwood family led to an abandoned homestead 30 miles north of Portland, its windows boarded and chimney-coled. Neighbors in the sparse community claimed no knowledge of the woman, though several crossed themselves when her name was mentioned. An elderly farmer, his face weathered by decades of harsh winters, finally provided useful information. "Crane woman left these parts before the first snow," he muttered, avoiding direct eye contact with Dr. Whitmore. "Said she had business down south in the coastal towns. Strange woman, that one. Babies she delivered. They were different somehow. Quieter than natural children ought to be." Dr. Whitmore's pursuit of the mysterious midwife eventually led him to a boarding house in the harbor district of Portland, where the proprietress confirmed that a woman matching Crane's description had taken lodgings in late November. The room she had occupied remained exactly as she had left it, the landlady explaining that the woman had paid for 3 months in advance, but disappeared without collecting her belongings. The chamber itself defied conventional description. Personal effects suggested a woman of considerable learning, yet the knowledge they represented belonged to no recognized medical tradition. Leather-bound journals filled with cramped handwriting documented procedures and remedies that seemed to blur the line between healing and something far more arcane. Pressed flowers and herbs hung from the rafters, their species unfamiliar to Dr. Whitmore's botanical knowledge. Among Macabre Crane's possessions, the physician discovered a detailed record of her attendance at the Blackwood birth. The account, written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be Latin phrases, described a delivery complicated by circumstances that challenged medical understanding. According to Crane's notes, the infant had indeed been born without signs of life, exhibiting none of the reflexes or responses associated with viable birth. Yet the midwife's record continued beyond the point where conventional medicine would have declared the case concluded. Her writings described a period of preparation, during which the infant's body was subjected to treatments involving specific herbs and ritualistic procedures. The text became increasingly difficult to decipher, filled with symbols and notations that bore no resemblance to standard medical terminology. Dr. Whitmore's translation of the more legible portions revealed disturbing details. Crane had apparently maintained the infant's body in a state of preservation using techniques unknown to modern medicine. References to the threshold between realms and the delicate balance of earthly and ethereal essence suggested practices that ventured far beyond the boundaries of accepted healing arts. The physician's growing unease was compounded by his discovery of correspondence between Crane and Constance Blackwood. The letters, hidden within the pages of one of the journals, revealed a relationship that predated the birth by several months. Constance had apparently sought out the midwife specifically, traveling to Vermont during the early stages of her pregnancy to arrange for Crane's services. The correspondence hinted at previous losses suffered by the Blackwood family, references to the others who could not be saved, and the necessity of alternative measures suggested that the infant Sarah Elizabeth was not the couple's first child, nor their first encounter with tragedy. Constance's letters grew increasingly desperate as her pregnancy progressed, pleading for Crane to employ whatever methods might ensure her child's survival. Mehitable Crane's responses were cryptic yet reassuring. She wrote of ancient knowledge and practices that transcend the limitations of conventional understanding. Her final letter, dated just days before the birth, contained a chilling promise. The child shall not be lost to the darkness, regardless of what nature may decree. There are ways to call back those who have crossed the threshold, methods known to my grandmother's grandmother. Dr. Whitmore's examination of the midwife's medical instruments revealed tools that bore little resemblance to standard birthing equipment. Silver implements engraved with unfamiliar symbols, vials containing substances that defied identification, and a collection of what appeared to be ceremonial objects suggested that Crane's practice extended far beyond traditional midwifery. The boarding house proprietress provided additional disturbing details about her former tenant. Crane had maintained unusual hours, often leaving the establishment well after midnight and returning before dawn. Strange odors emanated from her room, not unpleasant, but distinctly otherworldly, reminiscent of deep forest floors and ancient earth. Most troubling of all was the landlady's account of sounds heard from Crane's chamber during the night hours. Soft chanting in an unknown language, accompanied by what sounded like the gentle crying of an infant. Yet when questioned, Crane insisted she traveled alone and possessed no children of her own. Dr. Whitmore concluded his examination of the midwife's belongings with a profound sense of having glimpsed something that challenged the very foundations of his medical training. The evidence suggested that Mehitable Crane possessed knowledge and capabilities that existed outside the realm of conventional understanding. Dr. Whitmore's investigation necessitated a direct approach to the Blackwood family, despite his growing apprehension about the nature of what he might discover. The cottage that served as their residence stood like a dark sentinel among the towering pines, its presence seeming to absorb the weak February sunlight rather than reflect it. The physician's approach on foot through the snow-laden forest path was accompanied by an unnatural silence. No birdsong, no rustling of small creatures, only the muffled sound of his own footsteps. The dwelling itself appeared older than its reported construction date, as though the wood had aged decades in the span of months. The shutters hung at odd angles, not from neglect, but from some inexplicable warping that defied the normal settling of timber. Smoke rose from the chimney in a peculiar manner, dissipating too quickly in the still air, as if the very atmosphere rejected its presence. Constance Blackwood answered Dr. Whitmore's knock with a delay that suggested careful consideration rather than simple inconvenience. When the door finally opened, the physician found himself face to face with a woman whose appearance challenged his preconceptions. Rather than the grief-stricken mother he had expected, Constance displayed an unusual serenity that bordered on the ethereal. Her complexion possessed an almost translucent quality, and her eyes held a depth that seemed to reflect knowledge beyond her apparent years. The interior of the cottage defied the modest expectations suggested by its exterior. The rooms were furnished with pieces that appeared far too valuable for a lumber surveyor's family, their craftsmanship suggesting European origins and considerable age. Tapestries depicting scenes of pastoral life hung from the walls, yet closer examination revealed subtle distortions in the imagery, shadows that fell in impossible directions, figures whose expressions seemed to shift when viewed peripherally. Dr. Whitmore's medical training had taught him to observe details that others might overlook, and the Blackwood household presented numerous anomalies. The temperature within the cottage remained consistently comfortable, despite the inadequate heating sources visible. No drafts disturbed the heavy curtains, yet the air possessed a quality of movement that suggested unseen circulation. Most peculiar of all was the absence of typical household odors, no cooking smells, no evidence of daily life, only a faint fragrance reminiscent of flowers that bloomed in seasons long past. Constance received the physician's inquiries about her infant daughter with remarkable composure. Her responses to questions about the birth and subsequent events were delivered in measured tones that revealed neither deception nor complete honesty. When pressed about the circumstances surrounding the child's death, she spoke of complications that had been anticipated and preparations that had been made accordingly. "Dr. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying an accent that seemed to shift between regional dialects, "there are aspects of existence that medical training does not address. My daughter's journey has been unconventional, but not without purpose." The physician's request to examine the infant was met with neither refusal nor immediate compliance. Constance led him through a series of rooms toward the rear of the cottage, each space seeming larger than the building's exterior dimensions should have permitted. The walls were lined with books whose titles were printed in languages Dr. Whitmore could not identify, their leather bindings bearing symbols that seemed to writhe when observed directly. The nursery, when finally reached, presented a scene that challenged rational explanation. The room was appointed with furnishings appropriate for a living child, a cradle that rocked gently despite the absence of any visible force, toys arranged with care, and clothing laid out as though in preparation for daily use. Yet the atmosphere carried an undercurrent of something that existed between life and its absence. Within the ornate cradle lay an infant that appeared to be in peaceful slumber. Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood possessed the appearance of perfect health, her complexion bearing the rosy hue of vitality, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of natural breathing. Yet Dr. Whitmore's trained senses detected subtle wrongness in the scene. The child's breathing, while regular, seemed too deliberate, as though each inhalation required conscious effort rather than involuntary reflex. When the physician reached toward the infant to conduct his examination, Constance's hand intercepted his with surprising firmness. Her touch was cold, beyond what the room's temperature should have produced, and her grip possessed a strength that seemed disproportionate to her delicate appearance. "She sleeps deeply during daylight hours," Constance explained, her tone carrying a warning disguised as information. "The midwife instructed that she should not be disturbed until evening approaches. Her constitution remains delicate." Dr. Whitmore's medical instincts rebelled against leaving an infant unexamined, yet something in Constance's manner suggested that pressing the matter might yield consequences he was unprepared to face. The child appeared healthy, if unusually still, and showed no signs of distress that would justify overriding the mother's wishes. As the physician prepared to depart, promising to return the following evening for a proper examination, he noticed that the cottage's windows provided no view of the cemetery where the infant had allegedly been buried. The positioning seemed deliberate, as though the dwelling had been oriented specifically to avoid sight of the consecrated ground. The following evening brought Dr. Whitmore to St. Luke's Cemetery as twilight settled over Portland's snow-covered landscape. Father Ashworth had agreed to accompany the physician in his examination of the infant's alleged burial site. Though the clergyman's reluctance was evident in his hesitant manner and frequent glances toward the darkening sky. The cemetery caretaker, Thomas Hartwell, led them through the maze of weathered headstones, with a lantern that cast dancing shadows among the monuments. The grave in question occupied a modest plot in the section reserved for children, marked by a simple granite stone bearing the inscription Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood, December 12th, 1850, beloved daughter. The dates themselves presented the first discrepancy that Dr. Whitmore noted. The birth date preceded by 3 days what the baptismal records indicated, suggesting either clerical error or deliberate misdirection. Hartwell's examination of the burial site revealed details that challenged his 3 decades of experience maintaining the cemetery grounds. The earth above the grave showed no signs of recent disturbance, yet possessed a quality that defied explanation. While the surrounding ground remained frozen solid by winter's grip, the soil over the infant's resting place yielded slightly under pressure, as though warmed by some internal source. Never seen the like," Hartwell muttered, kneeling beside the grave with his lantern held low. "Ground should be hard as stone this time of year, but this patch, it's different. Not soft, mind you, but not properly frozen either." Father Ashworth's discomfort became increasingly apparent as the investigation progressed. The clergyman's usual composure gave way to nervous gestures and frequent consultation of his pocket watch, as though timing their presence against some approaching deadline. When Dr. Whitmore suggested examining the grave more thoroughly, Father Ashworth's objection was immediate and forceful. "The sanctity of burial must be respected," he declared, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. To disturb the dead without absolute necessity would be unconscionable. Yet, even as he spoke, subtle signs suggested that the grave had already been disturbed by forces unknown. The headstone, despite its recent placement, bore traces of weathering that should have required years to develop. More troubling still were the markings discovered in the earth surrounding the burial site, impressions that resembled footprints, yet possessed characteristics that defied identification with any known creature. Dr. Whitmore's medical training included sufficient knowledge of anatomy to recognize human footprints, regardless of size or condition. The impressions near Sarah Elizabeth's grave, however, displayed proportions that seemed to shift depending upon the angle of observation. In direct lantern light, they appeared to be those of an adult woman, consistent with a mother's visit to her child's resting place. Yet, when viewed peripherally, the same impressions suggested something smaller, more delicate, perhaps those of a child learning to walk. The investigation revealed additional anomalies that challenged conventional understanding. Despite the recent snowfall that had blanketed the cemetery, the area immediately surrounding the infant's grave remained clear, as though the precipitation had been repelled by some invisible barrier. The absence of snow created a perfect circle approximately 6 feet in diameter, its edges so precisely defined that they appeared to have been drawn with mathematical instruments. Thomas Hartwell's growing agitation became impossible to ignore as the examination continued. The caretaker's familiarity with every aspect of the cemetery's grounds made his observations particularly significant, and his increasing distress suggested encounters with phenomena that challenged his understanding of the natural world. "It's been working these grounds since I was a boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that had begun to stir among the headstones. "Never seen anything like what's been happening since that child was buried. Sounds at night, movements in the shadows, and that smell." The odor to which Hartwell referred became apparent as the evening deepened. A fragrance that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, reminiscent of spring flowers blooming in defiance of winter's dominion. The scent was not unpleasant, yet its presence in the frozen cemetery created an atmosphere of wrongness that affected all three men differently. Father Ashworth's reaction was the most pronounced, his face growing pale as the fragrance intensified. The clergyman began muttering prayers in Latin, his hands trembling as he clutched his prayer book. Dr. Whitmore noted that the priest's distress seemed to correlate directly with the strength of the unusual scent, as though the two phenomena were somehow connected. As full darkness settled over the cemetery, the investigation was forced to conclude without definitive answers. Yet the evidence gathered suggested that the burial of Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood had been accompanied by circumstances that transcended normal understanding of death and interment. The grave held secrets that demanded further investigation. Despite the growing sense that some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue, Dr. Whitmore's investigation into the impossible baptism required careful examination of the witnesses listed in Father Ashworth's records. The ceremony had allegedly been attended by 4 prominent members of St. Luke's congregation: Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, the banker's wife; Mr. Silas Crawford, a respected merchant; Miss Abigail Thornton, the schoolmistress; and Dr. Jonathan Mills, Whitmore's own colleague and longtime friend. Each individual possessed impeccable standing within the community, making their collective amnesia regarding the event all the more disturbing. The physician's first interview was conducted with Mrs. Pemberton in the elegant parlor of her federal-style mansion on State Street. Eleanor Pemberton had served as godmother to numerous children within the parish, her presence at baptismal ceremonies being so routine that her absence would have been noteworthy. Yet when presented with Father Ashworth's documentation of her attendance at Sarah Elizabeth's baptism, her reaction was one of genuine bewilderment. "Dr. Whitmore, I assure you that I have never laid eyes upon the Blackwood infant," she stated with absolute conviction. "While I cannot question Father Ashworth's record-keeping, I possess no memory whatsoever of attending such a ceremony. Indeed, I was confined to bed with influenza throughout the second week of January." Mrs. Pemberton's household staff corroborated her claim, providing detailed accounts of her illness and the physician's visits required for her care. Dr. Mills himself had attended her during this period, prescribing bed rest and isolation to prevent the spread of infection. The timeline made her presence at any public gathering impossible, yet her signature appeared clearly in the baptismal register. Silas Crawford's interview yielded equally perplexing results. The merchant's meticulous nature extended to maintaining detailed personal journals documenting his daily activities, a habit that proved invaluable to Dr. Whitmore's investigation. Crawford's entries for January 14th described a routine day of business transactions, with no mention of attending any religious ceremony. More significantly, his journal indicated that he had been conducting business in Boston throughout that week, returning to Portland only on January 16th. "And I pride myself on accurate record-keeping," Crawford explained, his confusion evident as he reviewed his own handwriting. "These entries are made each evening without fail, and they clearly show my absence from Portland during the alleged baptism. Yet I cannot explain how my name appears in the church records." Miss Abigail Thornton's case presented perhaps the most disturbing contradiction. The schoolmistress maintained detailed attendance records for her pupils, and her notations for January 14th indicated that she had conducted classes throughout the day. Several parents confirmed that their children had attended school as usual, with Miss Thornton present and accounted for. Yet when shown the baptismal register, she recognized her own handwriting in the witness section. "The signature is undoubtedly mine," she admitted, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "On the formation of the letters, the particular way I cross my T's, these are characteristics that would be impossible to forge. Yet I have no recollection of writing these words or attending any baptism." Dr. Mills provided the most troubling testimony of all. As Whitmore's closest professional colleague, Mills had been expected to offer rational explanations for the growing list of impossibilities. Instead, his account only deepened the mystery surrounding the Blackwood infant's baptism. "Jonathan, you must understand my position," Dr. Whitmore began during their private consultation. "The evidence suggests that you witnessed a ceremony that, according to all other documentation, could not have occurred." Mills examined the baptismal record with the careful attention he typically reserved for medical diagnoses. His expression grew increasingly troubled as he studied his own signature and the accompanying notation describing the infant's apparent health and responsiveness during the ceremony. "The handwriting is mine, without question," he finally acknowledged. "More disturbing still is the medical observation recorded here. I have noted that the child displayed normal reflexes and coloration. Such details would only be included if I had actually examined the infant during the ceremony." Yet Mills possessed no memory of attending the baptism, examining any infant, or even meeting the Blackwood family. His medical practice records showed no appointments or consultations involving the family, and his personal calendar indicated no religious obligations for January 14th. The collective amnesia of 4 respected community members suggested influences beyond simple forgetfulness or clerical error. Each witness had apparently participated in a ceremony that left physical evidence of their presence while erasing all memory of the event from their consciousness. Dr. Whitmore's growing unease was compounded by a disturbing pattern emerging from his interviews. Each witness reported experiencing unusually vivid dreams during the nights following January 14th, dreams involving infants, ceremonies conducted in darkness, and the sensation of participating in rituals whose purpose remained unclear upon waking. The investigation had revealed that the baptism of Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood had occurred through means that challenged the fundamental nature of memory, identity, and conscious experience. Dr. Whitmore's return to the Blackwood cottage occurred precisely at sunset, as Constance had specified during his previous visit. The timing seemed significant beyond mere convenience, as though the approaching darkness held importance for the examination he was about to conduct. The forest path appeared different in the evening light, shadows falling in patterns that seemed to guide his steps toward the isolated dwelling. Constance greeted him at the door with an expectant manner that suggested she had been monitoring his approach. Her appearance had undergone a subtle transformation since their last meeting. Her complexion possessed a luminosity that seemed to emanate from within, and her movements carried a grace that defied the natural limitations of human motion. The cottage interior had also changed, though the alterations were so slight that Dr. Whitmore questioned whether they represented actual modifications or merely his heightened awareness of details previously overlooked. The nursery, when they reached it, presented a scene that challenged every principle of medical science that Dr. Whitmore had spent decades mastering. The infant, Sarah Elizabeth, lay in her ornate cradle, no longer in the motionless slumber he had observed during his previous visit. Instead, she displayed the normal movements and responses associated with a healthy child of her age. Her eyes tracking movement and her tiny hands grasping at objects suspended above her resting place. Yet, Dr. Whitmore's trained senses detected wrongness in the scene that transcended mere medical anomaly. The child's breathing, while regular and apparently normal, produced no visible condensation in the cool air of the nursery. Her skin, though warm to the touch, possessed a quality that seemed to exist between the living and something else entirely. Most disturbing of all was the complete absence of the subtle sounds that accompany infant life. No gurgling, no involuntary movements, no evidence of the digestive processes that sustain human existence. Constance observed the physician's examination with an intensity that bordered on the predatory. Her attention focused not on her child, but on Dr. Whitmore's reactions, as though his responses held significance beyond simple medical assessment. When he attempted to use his stethoscope to examine the infant's heart and lungs, Constance's intervention was immediate and firm. "Such instruments are unnecessary," she stated, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to resonate from sources beyond her apparent knowledge. "Sarah Elizabeth's condition transcends the limitations of conventional medicine. Your examination must rely upon observation rather than mechanical intervention." The physician's visual assessment revealed details that defied rational explanation. The infant's eyes, when they met his gaze, displayed an awareness that seemed inappropriate for her age. Rather than the unfocused attention typical of newborns, Sarah Elizabeth appeared to study Dr. Whitmore with deliberate intent, as though evaluating his worthiness for some purpose he could not comprehend. The nursery itself contributed to the atmosphere of wrongness that pervaded the examination. Toys moved without apparent cause, creating gentle sounds that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The rocking chair in the corner maintained a steady rhythm despite the absence of any occupant. Its motion synchronized with the infant's breathing in a manner that suggested connection beyond coincidence. Dr. Whitmore's attempts to document his observations were frustrated by phenomena that challenged the reliability of his senses. Notes written in clear handwriting became illegible when reviewed moments later, as though the ink refused to maintain its original form. His pocket watch, normally precise in its timekeeping, displayed readings that contradicted the evidence of the setting sun visible through the nursery window. As the examination progressed, the physician became increasingly aware of sounds emanating from other parts of the cottage. Footsteps in rooms he knew to be empty, doors opening and closing without visible cause, and voices engaged in conversation conducted in languages he could not identify. Constance showed no reaction to these disturbances, suggesting either that they were normal occurrences or that his perception had become unreliable. The examination concluded without providing definitive answers about the infant's condition. Sarah Elizabeth displayed characteristics of both life and its absence, existing in a state that transcended medical classification. Dr. Whitmore's departure from the cottage was accompanied by the unsettling realization that his understanding of existence itself had been fundamentally challenged by what he had witnessed. The boundary between life and death, so clearly defined in his medical training, had proven to be far more permeable than he had ever imagined possible. The accumulation of impossible evidence drove Dr. Whitmore to seek answers in sources beyond conventional medicine. His investigation led him to the private library of Professor Cornelius Blackthorne, a scholar of antiquarian studies at Bowdoin College, whose reputation for eccentric research had made him a figure of both respect and suspicion within academic circles. The professor's collection included texts that mainstream institutions would not acknowledge, works that explored the boundaries between accepted knowledge and forbidden understanding. Professor Blackthorne received Dr. Whitmore in his study, a chamber lined floor to ceiling with volumes whose titles were printed in languages that predated modern scholarship. The elderly academic's appearance suggested someone who had spent decades pursuing knowledge that others feared to contemplate. His eyes held the particular intensity of a man who had glimpsed truths that challenged the foundations of rational thought. "Dr. Whitmore," the professor began, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated secrets, "your inquiry touches upon matters that civilized society has chosen to forget. The phenomena you describe are not unprecedented, though they are rarely documented with such precision." The scholar's explanation drew upon historical accounts that had been dismissed as folklore by contemporary academia. References to similar cases appeared in medieval chronicles, colonial records, and the private correspondence of learned men who had encountered circumstances that defied natural law. The pattern that emerged suggested that the boundary between life and death had always been more permeable than modern understanding acknowledged. The practices you have uncovered, Professor Blackthorne continued, represent knowledge that was once common among certain practitioners of the healing arts. Midwives, in particular, possessed understanding that extended beyond the physical realm into territories that modern medicine refuses to recognize. The professor's research had uncovered documentation of techniques that allowed skilled practitioners to maintain a form of existence in subjects who had crossed the threshold of death. These methods required precise timing, specific preparations, and knowledge of principles that existed outside conventional medical training. The results, when successful, produced beings that existed in a state between life and its absence. Dr. Whitmore's growing understanding was accompanied by a profound sense of unease as the implications became clear. The infant Sarah Elizabeth had indeed died during birth, as his death certificate accurately documented. Yet through the intervention of Mehitable Crane's arcane knowledge, the child had been restored to a form of existence that transcended normal biological function. The baptism, Professor Blackthorne explained, serves a purpose beyond religious ceremony in such cases. The ritual provides a form of spiritual anchoring that stabilizes the restored being's connection to the physical realm. Without such intervention, the subject would inevitably return to the state from which they were retrieved. The scholar's library contained detailed accounts of similar cases throughout history, each following patterns that matched Dr. Whitmore's observations. The subjects displayed characteristics of life while lacking certain fundamental aspects of living existence. They required specific conditions to maintain their restored state, including protection from direct sunlight, regular ritual reinforcement, and careful management of their interaction with the natural world. Professor Blackthorne's research had also uncovered the ultimate fate of such restored beings. The state of existence they occupied was inherently unstable, requiring increasingly complex interventions to maintain. Eventually, the accumulated strain of existing between realms would overcome the artificial supports, leading to a final dissolution that was absolute and irreversible. The Blackwood infantile, the professor concluded, represents a temporary victory over death's dominion. Yet this triumph carries a price that extends beyond the immediate family. The restoration process creates disturbances in the natural order that affect the surrounding community in ways that are not immediately apparent. Dr. Whitmore's investigation had revealed evidence of these broader effects throughout Portland. The amnesia experienced by the baptismal witnesses, the unusual phenomena in the cemetery, and the subtle wrongness that seemed to permeate the Blackwood cottage all represented consequences of the infant's unnatural restoration. The physician's final understanding brought no comfort, only the terrible knowledge that he had witnessed something that challenged the fundamental principles upon which civilized society was built. The case of Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood demonstrated that death was not the absolute boundary that medical science proclaimed, but rather a threshold that could be crossed through means that existed outside accepted understanding. Yet this knowledge came with the realization that some boundaries existed for reasons that transcended human comprehension, and their violation carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate beneficiaries of such intervention. Spring's arrival in Portland brought changes that extended beyond the natural cycle of seasons. The snow that had blanketed the cemetery throughout the winter months melted to reveal alterations in the landscape that defied explanation. The grave of Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood, which had remained mysteriously unfrozen during the coldest months, now displayed signs of disturbance that suggested movement from within rather than external interference. Dr. Whitmore's final investigation was prompted by reports from Thomas Hartwell, the cemetery caretaker, whose observations had grown increasingly disturbing as the weather warmed. The earth above the infant's grave had begun to sink, creating a depression that deepened with each passing day. More troubling still were the sounds that emanated from beneath the ground during the quiet hours before dawn, a soft crying that seemed to come from depths that exceeded the grave's documented dimensions. The physician's examination of the burial site revealed evidence that challenged his hard-won understanding of the Blackwood case. The headstone, which had shown premature weathering during the winter months, now bore inscriptions that had not been present during his previous visits. Additional text had appeared beneath the original epitaph, written in a script that seemed to shift between languages depending upon the angle of observation. Father Ashworth's reluctant participation in the final investigation stemmed from his growing awareness that the baptismal ceremony had created consequences that extended beyond his theological understanding. The priest's recent dreams had been filled with visions of ceremonies conducted in darkness, rituals that bore resemblance to Christian sacraments, yet served purposes that challenged the foundations of his faith. Dr. Whitmore, the clergyman confessed, his voice trembling with uncertainty, I fear that we have participated in something that transcends the boundaries of sacred and profane. The baptism I performed may have served purposes that I did not comprehend at the time. The investigation's most disturbing revelation came through careful examination of church records dating back several decades. Similar cases had occurred throughout the region's history, each following patterns that matched the Blackwood infant's circumstances. Families would arrive from remote settlements, children would die and be buried, baptisms would be performed under mysterious circumstances, and eventually, the families would disappear as suddenly as they had arrived. Dr. Whitmore's research into the Blackwood family's background revealed that their identities were as ephemeral as their presence in Portland. No records existed of their previous residence in Vermont, and inquiries to authorities in that region yielded no evidence of their existence prior to their arrival in Maine. The cottage they occupied had been purchased through intermediaries, whose own identities proved impossible to verify. The physician's final visit to the Blackwood residence occurred on a morning when spring mist hung heavy among the pine trees, creating an atmosphere that seemed to exist between seasons. The cottage appeared different in the pale light, its structure somehow less substantial than during his previous visits. Constance greeted him with a manner that suggested she had been expecting his arrival, though no appointment had been arranged. The nursery, when they reached it, was empty. The ornate cradle that had held the impossible infant now contained only shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Constance's explanation for her daughter's absence was delivered with the same ethereal calm that had characterized all their interactions. Sarah Elizabeth has completed her journey, she stated, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from sources beyond human vocal cords. The time between realms was always intended to be temporary. She has returned to the place from which she was briefly recalled. Dr. Whitmore's understanding of the case's resolution came not through medical diagnosis, but through acceptance of realities that existed beyond scientific explanation. The infant had been granted a temporary reprieve from death's dominion, a brief existence that served purposes he could only partially comprehend. The restoration had required sacrifices and interventions that created disturbances throughout the natural order, effects that would continue to resonate long after the family's departure. The physician's final entry in his journal, dated May 15th of 1851, reflected his transformed understanding of existence itself. I have learned that the boundaries we accept as absolute are merely conveniences that allow civilized society to function. Beyond these limitations lies a realm where death and life exist in states that transcend our comprehension. The case of Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood has taught me that some knowledge carries a price that extends beyond the individual seeker, affecting the very fabric of reality itself. The Blackwood cottage stood empty by summer's end, its windows boarded and its grounds reclaimed by the encroaching forest, leaving only questions that would never find answers. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.